Is America isolating itself from the world? For most of the modern era, the United States didn't simply have the world's largest military. It sat at the center of the global economic system. Countries wanted access to American consumers. Companies wanted access to American capital. Governments wanted trade agreements with Washington. And for decades, one of America's greatest advantages was that countries around the world wanted to do business with it. But something is starting to change. The United States is increasingly using access to its enormous market as leverage. Tariffs on Canada, tariffs on China, new trade barriers affecting products from countries around the world. The message from Washington is becoming increasingly clear. If you want access to the American market, America wants something in return. Hey, quick favor. I'm trying to get this channel to 5,000 subscribers as quick as possible. If you could do me a favor, hit that like and subscribe. Now back to it. From the Trump administration's perspective, this makes sense. The United States has one of the largest consumer markets in the world. So why shouldn't Washington use that leverage to bring factories home, reduce trade deficits, protect strategic industries, and negotiate better deals? But there's another side to that strategy. Canada is looking for more customers outside of the United States. China has redirected more trade toward Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Other countries are building new supply chains and trade relationships designed partly to reduce their dependence on any single market. And that creates a strange paradox. The more America demonstrates how powerful access to the market can be, the more incentive other countries have to make sure they don't depend on that market too much. So the real question isn't whether America will stop trading with the world, because it won't. The question is whether American trade policy is slowly encouraging the world to build a system where the United States matters less and less. So what is America actually trying to accomplish? Tariffs aren't simply about punishing other countries. There is a strategy behind them. For decades, American companies moved manufacturing overseas. Factories went to China, Mexico, Southeast Asia, and other low-cost markets. Consumers got cheaper products. Companies made more money, and global supply chains became incredibly efficient. But there was a trade-off. The United States has become dependent on foreign countries for products it once produced at home. Then several things happened. China became a political rival. COVID exposed how fragile global supply chains could be. Now wars and political tensions have disrupted shipping. And suddenly efficiency isn't the only thing that matters. Security matters too. The argument in Washington has become fairly simple. Why should the United States depend on a geopolitical rival for the industries it might desperately need during a crisis? That's where tariffs come in. Make foreign products more expensive, make domestic production more competitive. Start off by encouraging companies to build factories inside the United States. Use America's enormous consumer market as leverage. There are legitimate national security reasons behind parts of this strategy. Semiconductors, critical materials, defense manufacturing, energy infrastructure, certain pharmaceuticals. A country doesn't necessarily want the cheapest supply chain if that supply chain disappears during a crisis. Remember, where was China during COVID? But there's a difference between reducing dangerous dependencies and trying to manufacture everything at home. The United States cannot realistically produce every product it consumes, and it probably shouldn't. Start off with, Canada has energy and natural resources. Mexico has manufacturing capacity and proximity. Taiwan has advanced semiconductor production, while Europe produces specialized machinery, pharmaceuticals, vehicles, and other high-value goods. Trying to replace all of that would be incredibly expensive. So the real goal isn't complete economic independence, it's leverage. America wants countries and companies to decide that maintaining access to the U.S. market is worth making concessions. And in most cases, it's going to work. America is simply too large of a market to ignore. But every country on the other side of that negotiation is doing its own calculation. If access to the American market can suddenly become more expensive because of tariffs or political disputes, governments and businesses have a reason to create alternatives. Not because they want to abandon America, but because they don't want their entire economy depending on a decision made in Washington. So the world has started building alternatives. And we're already seeing that happen. Canada may be the clearest example. For generations, Canada's economic strategy was built around one enormous advantage: the richest consumer market in the world sitting directly across the border. Factories in Ontario could ship products into the United States by truck. Canadian oil could move south through pipelines. Electricity and agricultural products could cross the border quickly. It was incredibly efficient, but that efficiency also created dependence. Roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports still go to the United States. And when Washington demonstrated that access to the American market could become political leverage, Canada began asking a familiar question: how do we become less dependent on America? Well, Canada has started with more trade with Europe, Asia, more energy export through Pacific ports. Also, more infrastructure connecting Canadian resources to global markets. Canada isn't abandoning America. Geography makes the United States too important. But Canada wants more options, and Canada isn't alone. Europe continues trading enormous amounts with the United States, but it's also building more relationships with countries around the world. American tariffs are reducing Chinese access to the U.S. market. But Chinese factories don't simply shut down. They look for different customers. They started with Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and other growing markets. Now, the U.S. market remains enormously valuable to China, but China has more incentive to build relationships that don't depend on it. And this is the part that matters. These countries don't need to create some anti-American trading bloc. Simply need to reduce the risk created by depending too heavily on Washington. Well, businesses think the same way. If a tariff suddenly changes the economics of a factory, a company might move production into the United States. In fact, that's exactly what Washington wants. But it might also find new customers, production somewhere with access to several markets, or redesign its whole supply chain so one political decision can't disrupt the entire business. Governments, they want the same thing. More ports, more trading partners, more suppliers, more customers, economic insurance. And here's where America's strategy becomes complicated. The U.S. wants to reduce its dependence on other countries. But those countries are reaching the exact same conclusion. They want to reduce their dependence on the United States. And once those alternatives are built, they don't necessarily disappear when the tariffs do. A new pipeline lasts as long as you maintain it, while new factories and new trade agreements can reshape the whole thing. So every time another country builds an alternative to the American market, America's leverage becomes slightly less absolute. Of course, not irrelevant, not even weak, just a little less indispensable. Now, that may be the biggest long-term risk of the entire tariff strategy. Hey, this is Frank with America's Geopolitics. This is part 1 of a 2-part series, so if you like what you heard, stay tuned tomorrow for part 2.